Hi everyone, so welcome to microbiology, and this is your first lecture, so it is an introduction to microbiology. So before we get started, some general rules in the lab. You must always wear your full PPE, so that includes your lab coat, your glasses and your gloves, so your protective equipment to keep you safe in the lab. You must take notes, so at the beginning of every lab, I talk, so you take down your notes, what I'm talking about during the introductory talk, and then you can use them notes then for your introduction then into your lab report. I won't be handing out slides, so make sure you take your notes and you pay attention at the start of every lab. You must attend all labs. There's a 75% rule, because obviously you can't be a scientist if you don't attend labs. So there's a 75% attendance rule, and if you don't attend 75% of your labs, you'll fail the module. Your lab manual. You have to have a lab manual in the lab. There's no point in doing the experiment and then not being able to follow the guidelines or what to do if you don't have your lab manual. If you don't have your lab manual, you can't do the lab experiment. You can share with your partner, but if you and your partner don't have a lab manual, then you can't do your lab. A lab notebook is extremely important for taking notes. So if you label rough work at the start of every lab, to take down your notes and record what happened during the lab, and then obviously for your lab write-up. I won't be collecting the lab notebooks in the final week, because obviously you need them for every lab. So make sure you're doing it every week, because I'll be checking to make sure you are doing your write-ups. Because if this lab module is taken over 6 weeks, and you wait till week 6 to write up your labs, then you've probably forgotten what happened in lab 1, and it won't be as accurate as it would be if you wrote it there and then. The lab technicians aren't here to clean up after us, so you have to tidy up after each lab and make sure the material goes into the correct bags. So if anything is biohazardous or has come into contact with bacteria or anything like that, it has to go into the biohazardous bags. And tissues and gloves and stuff like that can go into general waste, because autoclaving is expensive. So we don't want to waste money. So anything that doesn't need to be autoclaved goes into household waste, and then anything that comes into biohazardous waste must go in. And it's extremely important that you ask questions. I get very worried if people don't ask questions during the lab, because you don't know everything. I certainly don't know everything. So when I'm explaining something you don't understand, don't be afraid to put your hand up and ask questions. Your general health and safety, which we won't go through till the first day of the lab, is in your lab manual. So it's on page 1 and 4. So we will go through that on the first day we're in the lab, and we can explain where the fire exits are, where the fire extinguishers are, etc. So make sure you read that, and then we'll go through it properly then in the lab. But make sure you read before you enter the lab, so you know exactly what we're talking about when we're in the lab. Your lab notebook, like I said already, is extremely important. You have to have a hardback notebook, because there's liquid in the lab, there's chemicals, and if you just have a copybook, it can get wet and it can get damaged. So a hardback notebook offers protection. Don't hand me up single pages at the end of the year, because they're not labelled correctly. I'll lose them and I can't correct them correctly. So everything goes into your lab hardback lab notebook. It's extremely important. Make sure you name it. There's no point in handing me up a fantastic lab manual and it's not named. I don't know who owns it, and I don't know whose lab manual I'm correcting. And then if you get a grade, I can't give the grades out because I don't know who owns the lab manual. So the layout of the lab manual, the title of the experiment. So what experiment are you doing? An introduction to the lab. So you've taken notes in my pre-lab talk. So introduce the lab. Tell the story of why you're doing this lab. Materials and methods. You can just write as per lab manual unless changes are made. So if I make changes during the lab, you record it there. Results. What were your results? What happened? And then discussion. Discuss what happened in your results. So in your results section, you just state what happened. And then in your discussion section, you state why this happened, why all this happened, and how come. Rough work. There's no point in having a lovely tidy manual or notebook and no rough work, because it shows me that you just wrote your experiment down. You didn't really understand what was going on, and you didn't take any observations. So a scientist observes what happens and why it happens. So you have to have rough work for this. An in-depth description is available on page 6 of your lab manual, so make sure you take that out and have a read. Your second year now at this stage, so you should kind of know how to write up a lab manual or lab notebook, but if you don't, there's a full description on page 6. Now to talk about corrections and grades. So how will you be marked in this module? So, grade considerations. Number 1, your attendance. On the right here you can see the form I'll fill out every week with the student's name and the attendance to be marked in. And then your lab book will be taken into consideration, which is 15%, your MCQ, your lab exam, which is 20%, and your CA. You have to attend 75% of your lectures and your labs. If you don't attend 75%, it's an automatic fail. And for the labs you don't attend, you must have a medical certificate. I will be looking at your lab book, and that takes in consideration 15%. MCQ is multiple choice questions, which will be based on the lab, and then that's another 15%. Your lab exam, which will be gram stain and streak for isolation. And then your CA at the end of the year. So what way is the lab carried out every week? First of all, there will be a talk. So this is an introduction into the topic of the lab. So why is this lab being carried out? We will then talk about microbiology terms. So different terms used in science, and especially for the lab. Then we'll have a brief overview of the protocol. So what exactly will you be doing in the lab, step by step? And it is only a brief overview because it is in front of you in your lab manual, and you will be expected to read it yourself the night before. I'll read over it during the lab, and then you'll be obviously reading it when you're carrying out your lab. And then questions. If you have any questions at all, you ask me at this stage. You can ask me throughout the lab, but any questions on my introduction to the lab, this is when you ask them. Then we move on to experiment. So you check previous week's experiment. So you check and see what results you got from the previous week. And then you carry out your experiment. And then laboratory manual check. So I'll go around and make sure everyone's lab manual is done. And then clean up. Like I said before, the lab techs aren't here to mind us or clean up after us. So all rubbish into correct bins. Clean your bench top with IPA. And leave the lab as you find it. When you walked into the lab in the mornings, it's nice and clean. So make sure you leave it like that when you leave.